one of the goals of today's webinar is to differentiate between generative AI and LLM. There is a commonly held notion that, LLM and GenAI is synonymous. I want to disabuse you of that notion. They are quite different. GenAI is a much more general framework that can be very fruitful for trading. I have heard from the mouth of some of the most senior quants in some of the largest asset managers. All they can talk about is applying GenAI for trading, and it is not really confined to using LLM because that is actually old news. So I also should mention that this talk is based on some of the things I learned from our new book, Generative AI for Trading and Asset Management, which will be available on Amazon towards the end of this month. So I have a co-author, Hamlet Medina, that is the true expert. I myself is merely you might call a student of GenAI, whereas Hamlet is truly the teacher. And I'm very grateful that he agreed to collaborate with me. In fact, I learned a lot about GenAI. I have no idea what generative AI was at a high level until I read Hamlet's chapter. So this is one of the great pleasure of collaborating on writing books because you actually learn from your co-author a lot. And also, fortuitously, we pick a good name for this book because it has a good acronym called GATHM. So that's easy to remember. Let's test if LLM has, give any sensible answer. So if you type mirror, mirror, who is the best algorithmic trading author of them all, it would return me. And from here, you can see how easy it is for the LLM to hallucinate. So don't believe everything you read from, any of the chatbots. What is GenAI versus discriminative AI? Well, what is discriminative anyway? Discriminative AI, or another term for it, is supervised learning, is actually something that we all do. Whenever you run a linear regression, that's discriminative AI or supervised learning. In probabilistic term, it is to say, what is the probability that you will get a certain outcome? Y. So Y is what we call the target variable or the label, and X, oftentimes called the features or the predictors or the covariates. So X, if we know X, we're supposed to be able to predict Y with some probability. That's what all of us have been taught what machine learning is traditionally. That's what all the hedge funds have been using until maybe 2023, until 2022 when OpenAI suddenly burst into the scene, right? Everybody understood AI as being, at least in the asset management industry, as being a discriminative or supervised learning, or at most generative, some people might use reinforcement learning, some people might use, a GAN, generative adversarial model, but generally speaking, we focus on prediction. That's what AI has been used in finance anyway. Well, GenAI asked the following question. What about P of X? What about the distribution of your features or your predictors? What about Px based on Y? That is, given that you know the outcome, let's say historically you know outcome, what about the conditional distribution of X? In general, what about the distribution of X and Y, right? I mean, all these probabilities are related by Bayes' rule, as you must know. So they are related, but we seldom ask these questions in supervised learning. We always focus on P of Y given X. If you are, training your data on thousands of samples and only one sample has this outlier, typically your model will not care about this outlier. And it will produce an answer as if this outlier doesn't exist. But if your feature that you feed into your AI model is one of these outliers, we certainly want to know. We don't want to blindly trust a model that are built on a bunch of values and that has never seen this outlier. So the traditional discriminative model has this limitation that whatever you stick in as the predictor, it will give an answer, even though that answer can be completely misleading because actually the model was not trained or have not been sufficiently trained on these outliers. That happened quite often in finance. The second reason why the importance of a, building a probability distribution of the features is important is that, well, you want to be able to simulate new samples. Why do you want to simulate new samples? We'll find out that if you can simulate the distribution of X, well, you can use it for a lot of downstream use. Risk management is one of them. Optimization is another one, right? So without knowing the distribution of X, you cannot simulate new sample. You can only simulate, the label Y, but that is meaningless because the Y, all about prediction. All finance is about knowing certain things. How do we predict? It is not saying that, oh, by the way, the market always go up. Yeah, sure, the market always go up on average, but does it go up when there is 25% tariff? Does it go up when the treasury bond goes over 4%? That is the condition. We in finance and trading looking for this condition. We're not just looking for the unconditional distribution of the target variable. That's anybody know that market go up forever. But what about this particular circumstance? That is the conditional model that we're interested in. And if you don't have a distribution of X, you cannot generate these kind of samples that is regime appropriate, that is environmentally aware. Given what we know is the outcome, what is the distribution of the features? So usual AI, we would ask, X might be images of dogs and cats, right? This is images of pets. But what about the distribution of X when we know that it is a dog? Well, we want to learn that. We want to know, we want to learn from dog pictures what constitute a dog, conditioned on the fact that it is a dog. What is the distribution of the images? That's what, all this chatbot gave us, right? We say, give me an image of a dog, show me an image of a cat. Well, that is the prompt. But given the prompt, what would be the image look like? And that's what GenAI gave us. In finance, if you apply the same analogy to finance, you would say, here, the X would be, let's say, a return series, right? And if you don't have any condition, the return series for the US, for example, index is always going positive, maybe average excess return of, let's say, 7%, right, a year. But we want to know what is the distribution of X when we are in a bear market. That's the conditional. That's the prompt. We're not interested in just modeling the unconditional distribution of returns. We are interested in saying, well, now that we are in a bear market, let's say, down 10% from the high water mark, what would be the subsequent return of series look like? What would be the conditional distribution of the returns? That's what a GenAI will give you. What is the point of getting all this conditional distribution? Well, risk management is one of them. Traditionally, risk management is based on VAR, for example, or CVAR. They are all based on simple parametric probabilistics model. Maybe somebody think they're smart and they say, well, they're outliers and fat tail, so let's use a T distributions instead of Gaussian distribution. Or some people say, well, you have to take into account the tail dependence on different assets in your portfolio as well. So let's use copulars instead of this simple multivariate distribution. All of that is great, but it doesn't take into account the condition. All these parametric models basically unconditioned models. Can you ask your copulars, well, what happened when tariff is 75% and when the bond is over 4% and when blah, 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 blah? Well, copulars typically cannot help you because this is too complicated. It's too complicated to model, but they are not too complicated for GenAI to model. That is where GenAI excelling, is to model the conditional probability distributions when you have a complicated set of prompts or conditions. The other second downstream application that is very useful is scenario testing. That's beyond backtesting, right? I mean, backtesting only tests your trading strategy based on the historically realized return, which is very limited. But trading is about the future. It's not what happened in 2008. It's not what happened in 2020. It's not even what happened in 2025 March. It is about what's going to happen tomorrow. That's what's important. Who cares what happened in the past? I want to know what happened tomorrow. But the conditions that are in place now is very complicated. We may not have seen the exact circumstance in the past, or maybe we have seen it for 1 or 2 days. How do we simulate that scenario? That's again where GenAI can help. It is that GenAI can generate number of possible scenarios based on a very complicated set of prompts. I call it prompts, but really it is a number of conditions of the market. And you can enter any indicator you want, and you can generate a time series that are conditioned on this market circumstance. And with this simulated series, you can test your trading strategy, stress test your trading strategy. Is it going to lose money under this circumstance? Is it going to stop out? Is it going to result in a margin call? Would entering at a lower threshold be better? All these questions can be answered with this sort of Gen AI simulation, and that cannot be fully answered based on a strict backtesting approach, because hey, in backtest you might have seen this kind of situation like what happened yesterday, maybe one sample during COVID or two samples, right? And that is not something that we should count on from an optimization or risk management point of view. For example, using deep reinforcement learning to optimize your trading strategy or optimize your portfolio capital allocation. The procedure typically is you first pre-train your model with a large amount of data. That is the beauty about GenAI, is that you can do this pre-training on data that may not be immediately relevant to you. You may be a Forex trader. Well, you should pre-train your model on equity data and futures data as well. You might be a bond trader, no matter, pre-train your data on stock and futures, because that built up a model where it is kind of aware of how financial markets move. They can have outliers, they can have this and they can have that. And so that's eliminate the problem of data scarcity. I mean, in finance, in application of AI to finance, that's a major problem, is that there's not enough data, particularly at a daily frequency. By applying pre-training, you overcome that problem because you can train on everything under the sun. I have read a paper that even train a time series prediction model on non-financial data, on like electricity demand data. But this paper that I cited below, StockGPT, that is trained only on financial data, and it showed that it worked, the pre-trained model worked. Now, it shows you the potential of a pre-trained model, because then you can fine-tune it with time series that is specific to the asset of interest. You train on stock data, you can fine-tune it with Forex data and see how well it worked on Forex trading. And that is the beauty of GenAI as well, is overcome the scarcity problem. Outlier detection is an important feature of GenAI, and that is particularly important in finance because there are lots of outliers in finance. It's hardly normal. So how do we do that? Well, in traditional discriminatory AI, as I said, if you stick in an X, no matter whether it's an outlier, you are bound to get a Y or a probability for Y, no matter what. But in GenAI, we are concerned about P of X too. We are concerned about P of X, and we are concerned about P of X and Y. So if P of X is nearly zero, that means, sorry, but you have not trained your model on these kind of outliers. Well, P of X and Y will be close to zero. We don't have that probability. And so if that's the case, we won't trust any prediction of P of Y given X. You just haven't seen this X. Why bother to have a conditional distribution of P, Y? It's misleading. Right? It's good, it tells you that you shouldn't trust your machine learning model, but also that also point to the benefits of pre-training. Because if you pre-train your model with a large sample of X on all asset class, well, it would have seen these kind of outliers somewhere. And so you can have a much more reasonable estimate of P of X or P of X given Y or P of Y given X and so on and so forth. And that is, again, another benefit of pre-training. It allows you to come up with P of X, even if it doesn't, it has this sort of event has not happened for your asset class, but it might have, maybe you're trading Forex and you have never seen this, but it has already happened in the bond market. So you will guess what is the consequence of given X, what's Y, because it has happened in the bond market. You just haven't seen it in the Forex market yet, and so on and so forth, right? So, if you are only training your model on the Forex market, you may not have been able to give a reasonable assessment of what might be the outcome. Why? But hey, your model is be trained on all kinds of weird outcomes in all kinds of markets. So now you have a much better sort of evidence, or you have a much better chance of guessing what would happen in the Forex market if this were to occur. So that's the sort of high level justification for us to dwell on GenAI, why we should study GenAI. You might call the day that GenAI was born is when Transformer was invented. And Transformer and the attention mechanism was invented at Google. The attention mechanism is a great advance over the traditional STM-GRU methodology to deal with this gradient problem, because the attention is mechanism apply weights to different inputs. I mean, the gates in LSTM and RGU also apply weights, but it in a less sort of surgical way, in a less precise way. Whereas attention apply weights to multiple different inputs, and those weights you can train them using supervised learning. So the way I like to think about attention is that it is a feature selection mechanism, right? Maybe a lot of you are familiar with tree-based models, decision tree, regression trees. But attention is such a mechanism. It does apply feature selection to neural, but more importantly, better than those features selection algorithm that was discussed for the tree-based models. This is a sample-wise feature selection. That means that the feature selection depends on the sample. It's not just depend on the variable itself. It depends on the actual value of that variable. And that is one crucial advantage of the attention mechanism versus the traditional feature selection. And it is the only mechanism that can work in the network-based models.